Good morning. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this morning's lecture on epidemiology and translation of optical diagnostics for male bladder outlet obstruction, a journey into rural Uganda. And I begin this morning showing you a photograph of some of the members of the community of the region of Shima, where part of our study took place, and a few of our collaborators here. And here, who were the nurses who worked in one of the clinics that helped us out. And so I appreciate you taking the time to come out this morning. I have 4 learning objectives for us this morning. The first is to provide for a definition of global health. And secondly, we're going to describe the components of the visual prostate symptom score. And we're going to learn how the visual score is different from the IPSS that many of us are really familiar with. And then finally, 3 ways that a clinical trial design could be adapted to suit a rural setting in a developing country. There are a few different definitions of global health. This one from the World Health Organization is the current definition: widespread health impacts that affect large numbers of people across boundaries of geography, time, and culture. It includes the impacts on the global ecosystem, so studies involving air and water and our food, and other health determinants such as poverty and genetics. Global health implies a context that includes the whole world and produces its own institutional complexities. In my own mind, this is the definition that I keep, much shorter, but has some of the same ideas or constructs within it, that definition by Copland, that global health is an area of study, research, and practice that puts an emphasis on improving and achieving equity in health for all people worldwide. And there are detailed definitions of what equity is and what the measures are that we do to determine equity. So the WHO goes a bit further and says that equity includes absence of unfair and avoidable or remedial differences in health interventions and outcomes among groups of people. So to meet the objectives for today, I'm going to tell you a bit about our Grand Challenges grant. And we had 3 parts to this grant. The first was to try to conduct a survey, an epidemiologic survey of lower urinary tract symptoms in rural Uganda. We then wanted to construct an optical device that could be used to do measurements of the bladder, and we needed to try to pilot test this out in a rural setting in Uganda. And this involved some very basic things, like how were we going to take the history, and could we collect data, and could we teach other people to collect data in this setting. A small sidebar. We know there are lots of causes of outlet obstruction, and this grant is not about diagnosing all the particular different causes. Rather, it has a much broader stroke. It's about doing some measurements of frequency of symptoms and testing out the ability to use technology in this setting. So just to acknowledge Dr. Andrew McNabb, who is here with us this morning, I want to thank Babak and Benham, who participated and made devices for this study, our epidemiologist Francis in Umbarara, who helped to conduct the survey, the university there, who provided us ethics, the head of the Department of Urology at Stellenbosch, who provided me permissions to use the visual prostate symptom score and encouraged me to work on development of that, as well as our sponsor and all of the staff that participated in Uganda. So this grant was a continuation of some of our prior work with the goal of developing a non-invasive optical device that could do some measurements of the bladder, tell us some of the physiologic parameters of the bladder muscle. The study went on between 2013 and finished literally like 2 weeks ago, so really recently. So what is the rationale? Like, why do this study now? Well, this is a photograph taken really recently by Andrew in one of the rural pharmacies in Uganda. And you'll recognize some of these drugs: finasteride, alpha blockers, okay, antibiotics, many of the things that are familiar to us. So the world is truly becoming a smaller place, and the availability of drugs to treat outlet obstruction is becoming more widespread. The other reason to do
are those free samples, or are they?
Those are not free samples. There's a tiny little tag there with a price on it, but they are relatively inexpensive. I will come back to that. So so that's a good point. They're not free, but they are still much lower cost than you would buy them here. So the other reason to do this study now is to deal with the topic of equity, and that's part of the rationale that we applied for this grant. In the early 90s to mid-90s, there were quite a few articles that read something like this: decrease in mortality from BPH, a major unheralded health triumph. And these kinds of studies looked at global databases and showed that death from obstructive disease had gone down in the developed world, but in areas of the world there were still high complication rates. So here Andrew would see this not infrequently, so the end-stage bladder that won't contract, patients with renal dysfunction. This is one of our collaborators here visiting one of the patients in his home who'd had long-standing obstruction. You can see him resting beneath his mosquito net. So just a bit about Uganda. Uganda's official language is English, but there are 37 local dialects. The population base is not too dissimilar from us, but their per capita income is just over $1,000. The government spending on health per capita per year is around $150. Okay, just to put that a bit into perspective. And the top 10 causes of mortality, they start with HIV, malaria, respiratory infection, but different databases put things like TB, cancer, particularly cancer, sometimes falls into the 4th or 5th category, and way at the top of the list is prostatic cancer by far. Other causes of mortality: road injuries, GI disease. So getting to Uganda. So I want to say first off that Andrew has made 3 trips to rural Uganda within the last 2.5 years. And the first leg of the journey involves Andrew getting on a plane, flying to London, so 9 hours. Then he gets on another plane and he flies another 9 hours from London to land on the edge of Lake Victoria at Entebbe. Then he travels an hour from Entebbe into Kampala. And Kampala is the capital. I had Andrew snap this picture. It's home to 2.5 million people. And this picture is really great because it shows some of the modes of transportation that are going to become important. We're going to talk about these shortly. But mostly people travel on foot, or the most common form of motorized transportation is the boda boda, which is like a moped. Okay, and so you may go by boda boda, so AKA you get on the back of someone's moped and this is how you travel. And rarely there are motorized vehicles out in the periphery of Uganda. And in the city there are markets and many of the fruits and vegetables you would recognize as being similar to home. But once Andrew gets to Kampala, he still has to get to where our study takes place. So then he journeys another 4.5 to 5 hours to get to Mbarara. And once he gets to Mbarara, then he still has to go another hour to get to the region of Shima. And that's actually where our study takes place. And so you can see by looking at Shima, it's quite different. It's clearly a rural setting. It's really spread out. There's dirt roads, much less infrastructure. And the population primarily is subsistence farming population. So this is where we conducted our survey, and we wanted to determine the type and severity of LUTs in the community at large, and we wanted to compare that to people who physically made themselves get to the clinic for treatment of LUTS. And then we wanted to try to get some idea of impacts on quality of life, psychological well-being, etc., some of these other constructs. So what we did was a cross-sectional survey, and it was done by individual interview by trained interviewers. And we used a few different instruments, and we chose these instruments in collaboration with the people locally in Umbarara and the region of Shima. So we measured the WHO equity social determinants. So where do you live? What kind of housing do you have? Availability of food, employment, transportation. We had them complete the English version of the IPSS, and then we gave a really long and detailed instrument by Epstein, which deals with lower urinary tract symptoms and some other constructs related to that, which means interference with specific activities, again, psychological well-being, worries, concern, and there are 4 items within there related to sexual functioning. So we interviewed 415 people in this community. 238 were people who responded to completing this interview as a general health questionnaire. And yes, we did actually have some people who were like over 100 years old complete the interview. It was like amazing. The support was phenomenal. And then we did 177 interviews. These are consecutive people who make their way into clinic for treatment of lower urinary tract symptoms.
How do you document
Did it self-reported? Did we check like the birth certificate? No. Okay, but it's self-reported, and you know, you got to.
39.
You got. And I totally believe it, because like what? I've only known you for 4 or 5 years. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the community there. So the mean age of the people we interviewed were in their the mean age was in the early to mid 60s. Almost everybody stated that they were married, very few people living single. The mean number of children in the household is 7 to 8 is the mean number. And the household size, the people that they're trying to feed and live with, is around 5 to 6 people per household. Nutrition, about 2/3 of the people indicated that they did not have sufficient food. I had Andrew take some photographs of the farming going on in the region. This is some children working out in the field. But the main form of food eaten rurally relies upon green bananas or plantains that are steamed and mashed. This is an example of the road and bicycles used to get around. But you know, I might think to myself, well, when you're sick, like, how do you get to clinic? Do you go by car? Do you go by taxi? I mean, how do you physically get there? And the clinics actually, like 96%, like the majority of people have some sort of health center within 5 kilometers of where they live. Most people walk to there. About half of people to the clinic would come by boda, almost never in a private car. And the cost of getting to clinic in about 1/3 of the people is more than $1 US. What about education? This is from Andrew's trip last November. He was visiting one of the local schools, and here's classes going on outside underneath one of the trees. In the clinic, about 1/3 of people have never attended school, and about 60-ish% have had just the first few years of primary education. So that becomes important when we're going to go on and talk about taking the history. Very few people post-secondary education. But almost everyone indicates that they're employed. When you ask them, are you employed? Yes, because when you are a peasant and farming and you're doing subsistence farming, you are working. And so almost everyone indicates that they are working. So just now I'm just going to touch really quickly an overview on what kind of symptoms people reported that they were experiencing. About a third of men in the community had sensation of incomplete bladder emptying versus about 2/3 of people who showed up at the clinic. And about 15% of the people in clinic indicated that they almost always had this sensation of incomplete bladder emptying. About half of men in the community had some degree of urinary frequency versus 82% of people who were appearing at clinic were complaining of that symptom. Intermittent stream, about 1/3 of men in the community had some complaint about that versus 2/3 of people who made their way into clinic. Difficulty to postpone. This is about 70 to 80% of people who came to clinic. This was actually a very big symptom. Like 25% of the people at the clinic almost always had difficulty postponing urination. And weak urinary stream, about 80-ish% of people in the clinic had some degree of complaint about that. About twice as many people in the clinic versus in the community complained of weak stream. And straining to urinate, about 25% of men in the community and about double that at the clinic. Getting up at night, almost everyone was getting up at least once at night, and both in the community and at the clinic, you know, 1 in 10 men were getting up 5 times or more at night. The interview, the really long interview with the Epstein questionnaire, has a quality of life index within it, and we have done some statistics and looked at relationships, but the general relationship of falling quality of life with increasing scoring for your lower urinary tract symptoms held true. And then just to say that the psychological well-being questions of that section, you know, about 40% of people, both in the community and in the clinic, thought that their psychological well-being was highly affected by their symptoms. There are some estimates that are available for the frequency of lower urinary tract symptoms, and the biggest study was done, reported in 2011 by Irwin and Abrams, and they did computer modeling, and they took different data sets, and then they did extrapolation of those, figuring out what various frequencies would be. And their estimates for Africa was that overactive bladder symptoms, they thought, were about 10% of the population, and that any combination of LUTS or OAB, so any one of these two constructs, were present in about 20%, and certainly our measurement found a lot higher number, this number sort of double, and this being closer to 60% in the questionnaire. So then we had to go on and do a little bit of the clinical study and the device testing. I put up this photograph. I'm showing you Andrew. Andrew, it's like 40 degrees out, but Andrew's there with his tie and his shirt. And I mostly want to show you this because we have community members and collaborators here, but I wanted to show you some of the area, what it physically looks like, where Andrew was working. So this is a typical building. It's got a wood frame, it's got mud bricks and a tin roof, and you can see inside, of course, there's no electricity. It's really dark, okay? It's really dark. So that comes into play soon. So we had 5 steps to do our clinical device testing: community engagement, figuring out the consent form, recruiting the patients, how are we going to take the history, and collecting the data. I want to say up front that Andrew made 2 trips there before this study actually began to get community engagement. He went in person, he met with community leaders, the local clinic staff here, And we met with people from the community to get a perception of would it be relevant to do this study. And this also, during this time, we linked with the local university to be able to get consent forms. So it's obvious, we think, oh, of course, the consent form would be translated into the local language. That would be obvious to us. It's important to remember that we have to provide the ability for people, and it has to be approved, that people can sign with an X with a mark rather than writing their name. You have to put in local terminology in lay English versions. So you'll see through our documents, it doesn't talk about emptying your bladder or voiding. It all talks about going short call. That's what emptying your bladder is. It's going short call. And that's over and over and over in all our documents. And then we want to be sensitive to requirements from different countries and cultures. That's really, really important. So some of the things that were in our English consent form from UBC were not acceptable to the people in Uganda, and we had to work through those and work out. And eventually, here's our consent form there, translated into Banyan Koli, where you can mark with the next tiny little fine print, the Department of Urologic Sciences. Okay, so this is our consent form. And now, recruitment. So here we put up posters, we put ads in magazines, we put ads in newspapers. Here's Andrew at one of our clinic sites, but you can see here, like, you put the phone number physically on the wall. This is the contact phone number is inscribed on the wall. Or you might use other forms of communication. So the thing to do is you go on to the radio and you sort of read what would normally be on a poster by the radio. So we were hoping to recruit 20 subjects. That's what we had hoped to recruit. Well, the next day, like 250 people walk to the clinic. And I have to tell you, so here's Andrew. Here's Andrew. It's like unbelievable, right? 250 people walk several kilometers to the clinic. And here are all these men, like I'm talking like they're 3 layers deep, like there's no seating. You're running out of seating. And here's Andrew. So here's Andrew, he's getting the consent form, and then we start doing the BMI, our scale. We're using the measuring tape. We're doing the height of the patients. And then we had to take the history. Now, we're really familiar with the IPSS, created 1992, adopted by the WHO, validated into over 30 languages. But we know that the IPSS requires a certain educational level in order to answer it. You need at least a grade 6 US education level. And remembering that reading it and understanding what it's asking you are 2 separate things. So there have been several really excellent studies done relating to education, and they find that, still if you have less than a grade 9 US education, about 10% of people may misscore by greater than 10 points due to misinterpretation. Not that you can't read the questionnaire, but not interpreting the question for its correct meaning. And we can think about, sure, there's other problems with interpretation, miscommunication, interpreter bias, accidental misrepresentation of the questions, and that there have been studies that show that this is compounded. If every time you give the questionnaire, it's used by a different interpreter. So these are challenges. So with this in mind, in 2011, Stellenbosch University in South Africa created the Visual Prostate Symptom Score. And the idea is that it's a non-verbal pictographic assessment of lower urinary tract symptoms. And here is the score. Now, the score asks only 4 things. Okay, right? So as opposed to the IPSS, this is asking only 4 things. And this picture in the center is the original picture that was developed by a clinician in Swaziland, and these other 3 questions were added to it. And this is basically, how often are you going during the day? The sun is out, you're working, how often are you going? Nighttime, the crescent moon, you're lying in bed. Again, how often are you going? What does the stream look like, and how do you feel about it? So what we did with the suggestion and working with suggestions from Stellenbosch, so the first thing we did to our sample is we gave the questionnaire cold. We just gave it and said, could you complete this? Then we provided a single explanation. And as Andrew would say, this form is about you going short call. How often during the day? How often at night? What does it look like and how do you feel about it? Okay? And then the patients re-answered the questionnaire with assistance. Then we give the question the IPSS. We give it, again, they have to try to self-complete it, and then we give it with explanation. So we had 34 people participate, mean 69 years. Most of the people were peasants and farmers within our group. And we had 7 people who had never attended school, but then a large proportion of people had up to grade 4. A couple of people had attended high school. And just briefly, just to say that, you know, over 80% of all comers could complete the VPSS without any explanation. And of course, only about 5% could complete the IPSS, which is obviously a written questionnaire. And then what we did is we got subject feedback. This is really important in the development of the questionnaire. This is my English translation of this visual analog scale, which is all written in, it's in Ugandan. Yeah, and so it's from 0 to 10. So how helpful were these pictures telling you to convey to us about your going short call problem? So what we found out from the patients is that the VPSS, they liked the overall score, but they want to tell us specifically more about urgency. There's no question there that deals with urgency of urination, and that the pictograms in the top need physical enlargement. It was hard to see them. And also, remember, this is sometimes being completed in the dark because very often there's no power, right? Also, there are a few other things from us that we learned about feedback, like we would like a 0 to be here, like say you don't get up at night. Right now you can't answer 0. And there's no construct for the concept of retention. So we would like a 0 here and a 0 here, i.e. no voiding, to convey the idea of retention. And this the patients really liked, but they wanted it to be more evident that we were asking them about how they felt about their urinary symptoms. Now, the original article of the Visual Prostate Symptom Score was used in 96 men in Africa. Most of them, however, had had schooling, so this population was different than ours, but still about 80% of people could complete it without help. Now, this score has been used in 5 other countries, and I'm just really briefly going to touch on each of these countries and give you like one take-home message to give you kind of an idea of what people are doing with this score. So the score last year was tested in rural Indonesia, so completely different culture, and they validated it against the IPSS, and they came to similar conclusions that they had come to in South Africa, that there was a high around 80% of people could complete this score on their own. The score was then tested at the National Police Hospital in Korea, where it was given before and after medication, and it was given serially over time. And in this study, they looked at flow rates and also the ability to sequentially give the score, and they concluded that it would be helpful and probably could be used in a similar way to the IPSS in longitudinal follow-up. Back to the original authors from Stellenbosch, they have evaluated the score in urethral stricture disease specifically, where they looked at calibration of the urethra, retrograde urethrogram measurements, and in the end, they found that the visual of the person voiding and the visual analog scale, those 2 questions were so highly correlated with their urodynamic findings that they felt that that tool, just using those pictures, they suggest could be used in the follow-up rather than doing some of these invasive tests. Importantly, they timed people, and it takes about a minute to do the VPSS. In Namibia, very recently, the score was given to a much bigger community who were completely illiterate. And again, they had high number of people who could complete it on their own. So that was a very important finding. And finally, the last culture, so it was tested in Turkey. And here, a lot of people had university education. So when you're taking like all comers and looking at their level of education, you know, it was developed originally with the idea to give it to people who were illiterate, but actually there's some feeling that it's helpful to use pictures fast, and like, why limit it to that scenario? So that's an interesting thing to think about. So then we went on, I'm going to tell you just briefly, we tested 2 different types of devices to see how they would be accepted. So these were NIRS optical devices. The first time we tested a traditional keyboard, laptop computer, and the system was wireless to the NIRS. And then most recently, Andrew tested a different configuration using a tablet. And although it could be used wirelessly, we tested using a wire to the NIRS device. So here was Andrew. He's at the clinic. We transport everything in the Pelican boxes to try to maintain things being water proof. Here's our traditional simple computer, and Andrew's meeting and orienting the clinic staff. Our data is kept by hand, written by hand in log books, apart from the things that are collected directly onto the computer, which is actually the NIRS measurement, but everything else is kept by hand by the clinic staff. The space that you're working in is really small. In all of these clinics, it's really small. So there's the width of the bed, there's you standing sideways, and then there's a tiny table. So it's not a large area. One thing we did learn is because the power goes off so frequently, it's actually better to have a bit bigger computer because it gives light actually into the room, and the keyboard is backlit. So that's actually helpful when the power is out. So here's putting on the device using bony landmarks, and then what the tablet looked like. So it's smaller. And actually the tablet was harder for the staff to use. It requires a lot of accuracy, especially when the screen is small. When you're doing Euroflow start or finish, you have to have a lot greater accuracy, and that was more challenging. Now, why do we have? Well, I have a picture here, but there's no picture there. There we go. Awesome. So this is a picture of showing with the tablet, with the NIRS and the wire being placed on a subject. So we trained 4 field personnel to use the computer. And the process involved a 30-minute orientation, a 1-hour hands-on by Andrew, and then see one, do one, teach one, and to the next person. And then in the end, the 4 people could collect data independently on the computer, and we have 60 tracings from the area. One challenge we had to confirm was that we could collect data in various levels of pigmentation of skin, and we published that this year, that we are able to get similar kinds of tracings despite skin pigmentation. So some of the challenges that we faced and some potential solutions, taking the history, I think we've become fans of the VPSS, and we have some ideas of how we would use and improve the VPSS. But we still need to have an interpreter with us That's because when we're going to do something like a uroflow study, for example, we still need to be able to have interpretation for those aspects of the visit. We're working always in really restricted space. So the traditional keyboard was much better than the tablet configuration. And the simplicity of the software is really, really important because you're there only for, you know, maybe 4 or 5 weeks, and people have to be oriented and be able to work independently after that. Cables are best avoided. Working with the cables, Andrew, I think will tell you, was frustrating in a small space, and much better to use Bluetooth. Power outages, it's always good to have some flashlights. That enables taking the history in the dark, even if you're using the VPSS. And then weather. You know, we're used to working in an environment where we are climate controlled, but being able to deal with water, I would get emails from Andrew, you know, here tonight, able to collect data, but torrential rain, really loud on the roof, and you know, no power. So working in the dark. I want to show you. This is my perhaps my favorite image of the whole study. This is a community member from Shima who had walked several kilometers to meet with Andrew to let him know that lower urinary tract symptoms are a problem in the community, and how grateful he was that some people were coming to look into this more in their community. So that was really, really amazing and lovely. So I want to say in conclusion, we believe that the burden of disease in rural Uganda is higher than the estimates from the ICS. We have some rationale and ideas for now developing the VPSS. So what we're going to do is enlarge some portions of it to make them be seen more easily. We're going to add the image of the person walking faster and running to be able to convey a testing of the construct of urgency. Can we collect data in the environment? Yes. Can we teach rural health workers? That was one of our objectives. Yes. So for us now, we have got all our check boxes completed. We're going to try to look to go on to the next level of funding for this type of study, which is transitions to scale. But we require a commercial partner in order to do that. It's part of the requirements of the grant. So we're currently seeking commercial partners to try to see if we can do now a larger study now that we know kind of how we would collect the history and what kind of physical equipment we need to construct. So thank you for listening to me this morning, and Andrew and I will take any questions.